Hello everyone. This week in our class we were planning on continuing on with our simulation chapter, and we were actually finishing up our project where we were modeling the predator-prey relationship, the wolf and the moose population on Isle Royale in Lake Superior. But it's been in the news a lot lately, this coronavirus. So we talked it over, the students and I, and we decided maybe let's try to tackle a coronavirus simulation and see if we can answer some questions or make some conclusions about test some hypotheses about virus and the rate of spread and air travel, things like that. So that's what we decided to do this week. And let's start off today by opening up Swift Playgrounds, and there's a nice template we can use, a challenge that we can use called Blink, and this is provided by Apple. And let's go ahead and see all here for the challenges or the templates. And if you scroll over, you'll find the Blink project. It says it's for beginner. We'll just go ahead and get that. And while that's coming up, I'll tell you a little bit about it. This is a challenge that simulates or reproduces this thing called Conway's Game of Life. And the idea behind it is there's a bunch of cells, and these cells have rules, and in some cases a cell will reproduce and create a new, an alive cell. And in other cases, maybe when this cell is surrounded by too many other living cells, that cell will become overcrowded and it will die. So you get these interesting patterns with just some very simple rules, some interesting patterns of cells coming alive, cells dying, and so on. So we're going to use this actually because it has a lot of nice background tools to create a model of a virus spreading. So let's change the name of this Blink to be virus, something like that. Okay, and this takes a little while usually to update the name change. But once it's updated, let's open it up. Okay. Open it up here, and if you haven't gone through this cell simulator yet, the Blink challenge, really you take time, stop the video, take the time and go through that and play around with things, change the algorithms. You'll see here, and it describes the rules for the simulation. Any living cells with fewer than 2 living neighbors dies, perhaps from loneliness or not enough community support. Any living cell with 2 or 3 living neighbors lives on, so that's kind of the sweet spot for life. And any living cell with more than 3 living neighbors dies from overcrowding. If your cell has exactly 3 living neighbors, if it's dead, it becomes a living cell then. So that's for reproduction with 3 living neighbors, a dead cell can come back to life, has just the right amount. So you'll see that this starts with a few cells that are alive. They're indicated in yellow. I pressed run there, and the rules are applied. You go across the grid one row at a time, and if you go through the rows and then each column in every row. So if you look in the code in this advanced down here, you'll eventually find this nested for loop where a loop for evaluating each column is nested inside a loop for evaluating each row, and that's how at every iteration through here it checks every single cell and applies these rules and decides whether the cell is now going to be idle or whether it's going to be living or dead. Okay, so that's pretty cool. I want to point out one other thing. Once this is running, you can tap anywhere on the screen and make some cells alive. So I'm going to drag down here in the lower right and create some living cells in a pattern, and then it keeps on applying those rules. So this is an interactive simulation too. A lot of students played around with this, and they didn't realize that you could tap on the screen and create some alive cells. Okay, so let's go ahead and stop this. Let's go to the next page here. Tap on this arrow here. Go to the next page. And this page is called Modifying the Rules. So this is where you get to play around with the simulation and the rules. So again, hopefully you've worked through this. If you haven't, go ahead and take the time to do that. If we run this simulation the way it is right now, we'll just see what happens here. So these cells, each one of these cells can be one of 3 different states. They can either be idle, in which case they have no character on them. They're just this pale blue color. They can be alive, which has the smiley faces on it right now. Or they can be dead, and they have the ghost emoji on there. So in this case, what happens at the beginning of the simulation, I'll start it over again, this little pattern of 5 alive cells shows up in the upper left-hand corner, and then it applies the rules at each cell, and there's some different rules in here, and these are things that you're going to play with to modify this. Okay, but before we go, I'll actually show you where the rules are. The rules are not in this tab here. These are all parameters for the simulation, properties of the simulation you can change. Okay, we'll come back to that in a second. The rules are in the Shared Code tab here. If I go to Shared Code, there's a function called Configure Cell, and that has the rules that are applied each time a cell is trying to update. So what happens is, again, it goes across every row and every column, and it calls this Configure Cell. And inside here, there's this statement called switch. And you may not have seen this switch statement before. It's basically like an if statement. So we could easily write this with an if statement where we would say, if the cell state is .alive equals .alive, then do this code in here. Else if the cell.state is equal to .dead, then you're going to do this code in here. Else if the cell.state is equal to .idle, then you're going to do this code in here. Okay, so switch just makes that a little, instead of having 100 different else if statements, you can instead do what's called a switch on the cell state. And cell state here just has, it's what we call an enum in Swift. And an enum has a certain number of states, and only that number of states. So in this case, a cell's state can be one of 3 different things, either alive, .alive, or .dead, or idle. And it can be only those 3 things. Okay? So think of it as a variable. It's just like an integer, but an integer can have, millions of different values. A cell's state can only have 3 different values, one of 3 different values, either alive, dead, or idle. And that's what these enums are really useful for. For example, if we wanted to sort of keep track of day of the week, well, there's only 7 possible values: Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. That would be a good opportunity to use an enum, days of the week, because it could be .Sunday, .Monday, .Tuesday, and it could not be 7 or 1,489. There's only 7 possible choices, .Sunday, .Monday, .Tuesday, and so on. So that's an enum. And oftentimes these switch statements are really useful for deciding which case of the enum that you're working with at this particular point. So again, here are the rules defined in here. If the cell's state is alive, then the rule says if the cell's number of neighbors is alive neighbors is greater than 2, then it's going to be changed to be dead because it's overcrowded. Otherwise, if the cell's number of neighbors is greater than 3, well, this one also says that it will be changed to be dead. So, sorry, this one is overcrowding. It's greater than 3. Here, this one is if the cell's number of neighbors is less than 2, then out of loneliness it dies. Okay, so you can play around with these things, and that's what you should do, is play around with these values and change the simulation in those ways. So there's other rules for dead and rules for idle here as well. We're going to come back to this in a minute. So let's go back to our properties of the simulation back here in our main program. And you can see a new simulation is created at the very beginning. It's set up with the property of a cell dimension equals 32. If you read through this here, you can change this value to be anywhere between 4 and 512. I want to change this to be 8. Okay, and I'll go ahead and run this just to show you what this does. It shrinks it up, and unfortunately what happened up here is it got put, our initial cells that got set to be alive got set under our reset button up here, but it's still going. So let's go ahead and change that too. Let's change this to be something like 20, and we'll set our initial alive pattern to be at row 20 and column 20, and run it again so it doesn't show up under the reset button. There it is. Okay, so it's now somewhere where we can see it. We can also change the simulation speed. That's another property of simulation, is dot speed. I think we'll speed this up a little bit. Let's make it 10. Okay, let's try running that, see if it's a little faster. Okay, nice. Runs along at a much better clip there. Now, we are going to take this blink challenge, and right now it's simulating alive, dead, and idle. And what we're going to do is we're going to change this a little bit so that it's simulating a virus and a population. Okay, so a cell can either have a virus or it'll be idle, means it doesn't have the virus. And maybe later on, if we make some nice progress, we'll make another one of the enum values represent a vaccinated cell. So the vaccinated cell cannot get the virus. It's been vaccinated. All right. But let's start with the really simple thing first, and let's change the look of this here. So alive, we don't want to be actually mean alive anymore. Alive is going to mean the cell has the virus. So let's change this smiley face in here to be something that represents the virus. Okay, so I'm just going to give it a V for virus. I've changed the character from the smiley face emoji to the V to indicate it has the virus. So remember, alive now means it has a virus. Let's also make this background something nice and bold so it stands out from anything else. How about a nice dark blue color? Okay, yeah, let's just see what happens here now. How different that looks. Okay, so there's our virus. It's a little V inside the inside a dark blue background. I like that. Dead now. Dead. We're going to ignore dead for now. Okay, so dead, let's just give it a space. Okay, so dead won't show up on our screen anymore. And the background, let's leave the background to be, or actually, since we're not going to use it, let's make it black. This will never happen. It'll never be black, but once we get done finishing our code, because we won't have dead things anymore. But for right now, let's do that. And let's keep idle the same color. So right now, let's see what happens. So there are going to be some dead places. They're going to be black, and the virus is in this dark blue with the V marked on it. Okay, I like this configuration. Let's move over now into our shared code tab and take a look at the configure cell. And this function, we're going to keep the switch statement in here. And we're going to do something different whether it's alive, but let's go ahead and clear out. One thing before we get too far along here, be careful. Inside this shared code, there are actually two functions. One is called configure cell. One down below it is called advanced configure cell. We're not going to use this advanced configure cell for right now, so I'm going to comment this out just to be sure I don't change any code inside here and think I'm changing it in the other one. So I put this /* at the beginning of what I want to comment out, and then I'm going to end my comment down here with a */, the reverse of the other thing. So now everything inside advanced configure cell has been commented out. This whole switch statement has been commented out, so advanced configure cell will do nothing. Okay? And that way I won't accidentally change something in there and think I'm changing it in configure cell. So we're going to be going back and forth a few times. All right. Now, let's put some comments in here. Let's get rid of this. So we're no longer going to be working with living and dying. We're going to be working with having a virus or not. Okay, so here, just to remind myself, I'm going to say cell has virus for alive. And I'm going to get rid of all this stuff. We'll deal with that in a minute. Dead is no longer going to be dead. Dead is going to be unused. This case is unused. Okay. And idle is going to be the case where the cell does not have the virus. Okay, so those are going to be our three cases, and we can go ahead and fill them in. For right now, we're going to say if a cell has a virus, it's going to always have the virus. So all we need to do here is, again, if we come through here and the cell state is it's dot alive, we're going to keep it alive. We're going to say cell dot state equals dot alive. Okay, we probably don't need to do that because if it's alive, it's going to always stay alive. But this helps me see what I'm doing. Okay, if it's dead, since we're not going to use this, it's always going to be dead. So we'll say again, the cells dot state equals dead here. So in the case where a cell has the virus, it's going to always have the virus. And in the case where the cell is dead, since we're not going to be simulating dead right now, we're going to say it's going to stay dead. Okay, so this idle case is where all the fun happens. Okay, and this fun, what I mean by that is that we're going to have to decide whether we want to give this cell the virus or not. Okay, so what should be our rules for if a cell gets the virus? Well, in class today we talked about a couple things, and you need to think about how a virus works. Two things. In fact, go ahead and pause the video and give some thought as to what what are the things that, if you're worried about getting a virus or you think there's a potential for you catching a virus, what are the things you want to avoid, or what's the most likely situation that you would catch a virus? Okay, so pause the video, give some thought to that. All right, and so I'll give you some ideas on what we talked about in class today. We talked about how if you come in contact with another person with a virus, you're more likely to catch a virus. And in fact, we took that a little further and we said, the more people you come in contact with, or the more people that are near you that have a virus, the more likely you are to catch the virus. Okay, so your chances of catching the virus go up as the number of people around you that have the virus increases. Okay? So that's the one main thing we decided. But we also decided it might not be the case that even if there's a bunch of people around you who have the virus, sometimes you still won't get the virus. So there's an element of randomness to it, maybe. Maybe it's randomness. Maybe it's something like, you've been eating healthy food the past couple of weeks and your immune system's way up. You've been getting plenty of sleep. Maybe your particular genetic makeup is more immune to these kinds of viruses than somebody else. There could be all kinds of different things in here, which means that, just because the people around you have a virus doesn't necessarily mean you'll get it. It just increases the probability. Okay? So we like to be able to model those two ideas. The idea that your chances of getting it increase the more people that are around you that have it, and the idea that there's still some random element to it or some unknown element to it that you won't necessarily always get it. Okay? So here's what we settled on, and you should again pause the video here and think of a rule that you might make up that would say, cover those two bases. And then when you come back here, we're going to talk about how you might do that. So let's tackle this first part first. This element, sorry, maybe the second part. This element of randomness. This element of randomness that you may get it or you may not get it. So one thing we could do is something like this. We could make some threshold, okay? Let's say var threshold equals 0.9, something like that, okay? And then if I were to say I only want a 1 in 10 chance of getting a virus, but I don't want to ever know if if I'm going to get it this particular time or not, we could make a random variable and check if the random variable is greater than or less than this 0.9. That will determine whether we get the virus or not. Okay, so let's go ahead and say let random equals some double, and the way you make a random variable is to say double.random, a random value, double.random, and you need to give it a range here in the range 0.0 up to 1.0, something like that. So that's going to give me a random value between the range 0 and 1.0. And what I'm going to do here is then say if, I'm going to close this up here so we have a little room to work. Okay, and I can say something like if random is greater than threshold. So how often will that happen? How often will a random number between 0 and 1.0 be greater than the threshold, which is 0.9? It should happen 1 in every 10 times, right? About, on average, I'm saying 1 in every 10 times. So this will just happen 1 in every time we will get the virus. And to get the virus, we would do something, all we would have to do is change our cell's state, which is now idle, right? So we would say cell.state equals, to have the virus means it's alive, and I'll choose the alive possibility. Okay, so that will change our cells alive, our cell state to alive. Okay, let's just have a look here at what's going to happen here. Now remember that rule is going to be applied to every cell. We go along every 10 times a second. It's going to go through every one of these cells, and it's going to apply these rules, and so you have a 1 in 10 chance of catching the virus. So let's take a look at that. Okay, so there it is. That's kind of a bad situation. Eventually everybody gets the virus, because even if they have a 1 in 10 chance, after about 1,000 tries, you're going to get hit with the virus. So the whole domain here gets filled up with virus with this rule. So, okay, we're off to a good start. We handled this part about randomness in here. Now, let's talk a little bit about the idea of if you have, the more neighbors you have with the virus, the more likely it is that you'll get it. So, what we decided to do here was we decided to change our threshold and make our threshold, instead of being a constant 0.9, we want this threshold to be a really big number if you have no neighbors with the virus, and we want that number to get even smaller and smaller and smaller, the number depending on the more neighbors you have with the virus. So fortunately, I'm just going to type this in here and show you again. Cell dot, we have a property here called number of alive neighbors. Remember, in this case, that's going to be the number of neighbors who have the virus, because alive means having the virus now. We've changed that. So cell dot number of neighbors that have the virus, we've got that value here. Okay, so when we did this in class, we talked about maybe having this threshold in here where it depended on the number of neighbors that had the virus, and it was big if no neighbors had the virus, and it got smaller and smaller and smaller. The threshold got lower and lower and lower the more number of neighbors we had. So our students came up with this idea. They said, let's let the threshold for a given cell be 100 or 1 if if nobody has the virus, then you can't get it either, because the threshold will be 1 and you can never get a random number that's greater than 1. Okay, but then we subtracted off something about the cells dot number of alive neighbors. Now this is an integer, so first thing we'll do, let's change this to be a double. I'm going to wrap this in a double, make an instance of double out of that integer. So here I'm going to say 1.0 minus cell's number of alive neighbors. Now that value, if you think about it, any cell could have 8 possible neighbors around it. Okay, 8 possible neighbors around it. So we don't want to be doing 1 minus 4 if 4 neighbors have the virus. But let's scale this down maybe. In fact, if we multiply this by 0.1, okay, now make this small again so we can see. Okay, so now if we multiply the number of alive neighbors by 0.1, if we've got 1 alive neighbors, that's going to be 0.1. If we've got 7 alive neighbors, that's going to be 0.7. And we'll be taking 1.0 minus 0.7, or our threshold will be 0.3. Okay, so you can see how our threshold now depends on the number of alive neighbors, and it goes down. If you have no alive neighbors, it's going to be 1. If you have 1 alive neighbor, it's going to be 0.1 times 1, or 1 minus 0.1, which will be 0.9. The threshold with 2 alive neighbors will be 1.0 minus 0.2, which would be 0.8, and so on. So it's going to be 1, 0.9, 0.8, 0.7, 0.6, and so on, depending on the number of alive neighbors. So that's our threshold, okay? All right, so that's nice. Let's get rid of this threshold definition down here, and from now on, our threshold will depend, right up here, on our number of alive neighbors. But we're still going to check the random thing in here, and so now we've got both of those ideas in one, where we have the chance of you getting a virus has some random element to it, but it also depends on the number of neighbors who have the virus. So let's give this a try. I'm going to blow this up, and we'll start it over and see what happens now. Okay, so now you don't get idle cells getting the virus just out of random chance. It actually has to have some neighbors with the virus in order for us to get it. Okay? All right. Eventually, still, everybody gets it. Now, let's move on here and let's talk about some experiments we can do with this. You might hear a lot in the news about how some of the reaction to this virus is that governments are starting to limit air transportation, and it might be nice to know why this might help, or if in fact it does help at all. And we can actually do some tests here. But before we go ahead and do these tests, let's go ahead and, with this current configuration of our virus simulation, let's take some timing. Let's time how long it takes for the entire population to get the virus, and then we can test, do some experiments where we simulate air travel among the population and see if that changes and how it changes the spread of the virus. Okay, so I'm going to get my watch out here, and I'll press run, and I'm going to do a timing of this. In fact, maybe we'll do it 3 times here. Okay, go. Okay, we're at 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15, no, 16, 17, 18, 22 seconds about. 22 seconds. I'm going to run it one more time. Okay. There's 5, 10, 15, about 21 there. So about 21 or 22 seconds it takes for this virus to spread over the whole domain. So feel free to, if your code's running a little bit differently than mine, get some timing stats for it. Write down maybe take the average of 3 different tests to see about how long it takes with these rules, with no air travel. How long does it take for this virus to spread? Okay. All right, let's go ahead and make our code big again. So air travel, if you think of what's going on here, air travel is what really happening. What the concern is that people in virus parts of a domain might sort of move or travel for a little bit of time into a part that's not infected. Okay? So we've got these big areas of open space that are idle in our simulation. The concern is that someone with the virus might pop up in one of these idle places, and then we'll see what happens. So again, we're working with really simple model here, and it doesn't need to be complex in order to see the effects of this. So let's think about a really simple way to do this. And I think if we do this, something similar to what we did before, where we make some threshold and pick a random value, if we make that random value be very small, about the same amount of probability of a person, say, flying out of your town and into some other town, if your town happens to be the one that currently has a high rate of infection of virus people, of people with virus, then they will, maybe one of those person that travels out of your town and into another area will be a transporter of that virus. But that doesn't, it's just a low amount, pretty low probability of a person in your town flying on an airplane at any given day, right? So let's think about this a little bit. I think what we'll do is we'll maybe look at this idle case again, and what we want to have happen is just randomly from air travel some possibility of a virus showing up in a random area. Okay, so let's do this here. Let's say, let's make another random variable. So let random traveler, and I'm just going to copy this here. And paste it in here. We're going to again pick a random number between 0 and 1. And here then maybe we'll say something like if random traveler is greater than some really pretty high probability, something like 0.9999. Okay, that means there's a 1 in 10,000 chance that some virus, some cell from a virus part of the domain will pop up in an idle cell. And that's about right. I mean, with the students and I were talking about, how many people travel each day, and if you take the population, maybe it's 1 in 1,000 of your population, or maybe 1 in 500 or so are traveling on an airplane on any given day. That's probably in the ballpark anyway. So the chances of someone with the virus will make it be 1 in 10,000, something like that. Okay, so we can play with these numbers. That's the beautiful thing about having a nice model or a simulation, is you can tweak these values and do experiments on them and see if they're realistic for one, and what kind of effects they have on the model. So here we're going to say if our random value between 0 and 1 is greater than 0.99999, again, a really low probability, and we're in the idle state here, we're going to make this cell state equals dot alive. Okay, we're going to give the virus to that cell. Okay, so really low probability of just some random place in the idle area popping up and due to air travel. So let's take a look at that. We'll see what happens here. Aha. Okay, so with that particular value here, run it a couple of times, you could see different little sort of seeds of virus pop up in different parts of the domain, and the virus spreads from that person on. So let's do some timing tests. Before we said we were around 21 or 22, right, without the air travel. So I'm going to get my watch out here, and in 3, 2, 1, go. 5. Okay, so that's about, well, pretty close to 10 seconds. We'll try it one more time. Ready, set, go. 5. Yeah, 10 seconds, about 10 seconds. So the speed of the virus, it's been a little less than half as fast. It travels in about half the time, or a little less than half the time it fills up this space. Let's go ahead and, if you want to, make it a little harder, just to play around with this a little harder for air travel to happen. I added another 9 to this, so we've got 0.999. So this is 1 in 100,000 chances of an air travel happening. Let's just see what happens here. Okay. All right, nice. Okay, really simple. That's probably also faster, but not a lot faster. Let's try maybe taking 1 9 off. So it's 1 in only 1,000 here. Let's see how fast this happens here. Okay, so that's not going to take long at all. So really pretty clearly here you can see that if you can cut back air travel and keep this virus from spreading so fast, it's the rate at which the virus spreads really depends on keeping it in a local area as long as possible. So play around with this code, and especially this value of the random traveler threshold. And really we should take this number and probably make a new threshold value up here so that it's easier to change, but I'll let you do that with your code. So I'll maybe make a note to myself in here, make 0.9999 below be a threshold constant, something like that. Okay, so that'll remind me to clean this up in a little bit later. Maybe move it up to the top, this value, give it its own variable name, something like, traveler rate or something like that. Okay. All right. Now, let's talk a little bit about vaccines, because we've got this nice code here where we're using alive. We're using alive to represent the cells that are alive, that have the virus, and we're using idle to represent cells that don't have the virus. Well, we have another one here. We have dead, right? Dead, instead of it being unused, let's go ahead and say this case is used to represent cells that have been vaccinated. I think that's how you spell it. Dead will no longer be just a state that, well, it might be that if a cell is vaccinated, it will always be vaccinated. That's pretty good here. But we'll definitely want to maybe come in here, and instead of making, like right in here, if a cell is idle and we determine that it's going to, that it exceeds the threshold and it's going to get the virus, okay, we are going to say, let's check and say if the cells.state is not equal to dead, that means it has not been vaccinated, then we're going to make it alive. But if it has been vaccinated, it's not going to get the virus. Okay? Okay, so from now we're not going to just always change if the random value beats the threshold, which again is random, and it also depends on the number of neighbors that have the virus. We're not just going to straight away change it to get the virus. First, we're going to check and see if it's not vaccinated, or if it's not equal to dead, then we're going to give it the virus. If it is vaccinated, we're not going to change it to be .alive. Okay? Now, how are we going to make something be vaccinated? Well, we can come up here and just sort of, if you think about vaccinations, when you create a vaccine, or at least in this case, there's no vaccine for the coronavirus. So what's going to happen is, hopefully a vaccine will get invented, created, and then it will get distributed to people, but it's not going to just be distributed to everybody right away. It's going to take some time to be distributed throughout the population. And the rate at which this vaccine gets created and distributed is probably the critical factor on how far it and how wide it spreads. So we're going to try to simulate this again using random numbers. And we'll say, there's some likelihood that a cell will get vaccinated. Okay. So let's come up here. And again, inside our idle, I'm going to go ahead and make this big again. Inside idle, let's make an idle cell be vaccinated at some particular rate. So again, let's say let vaccination probability or something. Let's make the vaccination. I'll say vaccination random. Again, it's going to equal a double dot random in the range 0.0 up to and including 1.0. Okay, and we'll check here and we'll say something, like if vac random is greater than some vaccination threshold, then we will set the cell's state to be vaccinated, which is .dead. Okay, and we haven't defined this vaccination threshold yet. So let's come up here and we'll do that up here. We'll say let and let's make it a var because we might change this. Vaccination threshold equals something like 0.999 or something like that. Okay, so that's the vaccination threshold. 999. Okay, so it's 1 in 1,000 chances you're going to get the vaccine. Now, remember what's happening is every cell that gets evaluated, that counts as one. So as it goes across all the rows, that's going 1, 2, cell 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so on. So every 1,000 cells should get vaccinated. So and that should indicate then as dead, or it should be just a black spot with no V in it will be vaccinated. So let's go ahead and run this, see what happens. Okay. So the vaccine the vaccine gets scattered around to not too many people here. And in fact, it's not enough to contain the virus. The virus still spreads throughout the whole domain. But remember what we talked about a vaccine, once it gets developed, it's not just going to be, say, one lab that will develop the vaccine. What will happen is they'll write down or publish the recipe for this vaccine, and hopefully it'll get spread to lots of different labs in lots of different countries, and they'll make as much of this vaccine as possible, and then it'll get distributed to all the hospitals and clinics, and so there'll be lots of distribution points, and hopefully as time goes, the rate at which the vaccine gets applied will grow each time. It'll grow with time more and more rapidly. So we can model this by using our vaccine threshold here. And even though it's a it's a high threshold right now, what we'd like to do is maybe make this smaller and smaller and smaller each time, which will make the chances of you getting the vaccine higher as time goes on. So we can do that after this switch statement, like after you've checked a cell. Let's go ahead and say, let's make the probability of this vaccination threshold, let's make it a little bit smaller. So vac threshold, we're going to subtract off some vac threshold equals whatever it was before, and minus some really small number, something like this maybe. So say as it gets a little bit more likely you'll get the vaccine each time. We may have to play around with this number, but let's give it a try and see what happens here. Okay, so the amount of vaccine should get higher and higher each time, and I don't think we're doing it fast enough there, so let's go ahead and maybe take a couple zeros off. Let's try this. Okay, something is still not right with this. I don't think, let's see, it's set up here. We don't want this to be inside. So what's happening is every time we run configure cell, this is getting reset to be 0.999. So we want this to be set to this at the beginning here, but not every time through. So there's a little bug in our code here. So let's cut this out of here, and let's put it outside the function so it doesn't get called, doesn't get reset to that every single time. Sorry about that. Okay, so it gets set to be 0.999 at first, and then every time this function called, it gets a little bit smaller each time. And there's another way to write this, of course. Hopefully you've seen this. Well, let's just keep it like this for now, and then I'll show you the shorter syntax for this. Let's run it here. Watch. Oh, okay, that's too fast. So let's go ahead and in here, let's put this back to what we tried before, something like that. Okay, so there you can see that the virus went a little bit of ways, and we even got some little areas from air travel that got it, but it did get caught. So if we make this even a little more slower rate of vaccine distribution, you can see that it'll spread a little bit more. Okay, but eventually it gets stopped, and not everybody gets the virus. So what we'd obviously like to do is develop this vaccine as fast as possible, and then if I take away 2 zeros here, maybe, and we run the, what happens here is it gets, the vaccination rate is enough that it just stops this virus right in its tracks here. Okay, so you can see that there's some values in here that are really powerful, and the rate at which you develop a vaccine, and especially the rate at which you get it distributed and applied to people, that will really stop this virus right in its tracks. So just as I promised here, I'll show you the right way to, in Swift you would say minus equals. That does the same thing as that line before, and we'll go ahead and run this. And boom, so, maybe we get a couple little pockets of the virus, but it certainly stops it from spreading around the whole domain here. Okay, so that's all I had here for you. We had a lot of fun with this in class and learned a lot. Now, what I would suggest you do is a couple of things. One is we should really clean up this code, and we should bring these threshold values, give them all numbers like this right here. We should not have numbers like this. This should be set to some constant up at the top, and that'll make it easier to change and run experiments with. This one also, you want to maybe call this a vaccination threshold rate or something like that, or change in vaccination threshold, something like that would be a good name for a variable to hold that. So that you'd want to change. Another thing that bothers me about this code a little bit is we did this same thing a lot of times, this idea of making a random number between 0 and 1 and then checking if that random number is greater than a threshold. Okay, we did that 3 different times. So I think what you might want to do as an interesting homework assignment is make a function and make that function take some input, say, and return a Boolean. And the Boolean value would indicate whether it randomly beat a threshold or not. And then hopefully then instead of having these whatever 1 2 3 4 lines of code everywhere we would do that same idea, you would instead be just calling one simple call to a function that would return a Boolean, and then you could simply just call that function and change the state to be dead or alive or whatever. So think about that if you want to, and that would really clean up this code a lot, I think. But it's pretty simple the way it is right now, and I think it effectively models or simulates this idea of a virus. So, and don't forget, you can also run this in full screen mode if you want to. That gives you even more cells to work with. You can play around with it. Have fun. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.